This is House Planning Help episode 111. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal, still to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August this year. Coming up in this session, my guest is Nick Grant from Elemental Solutions, and we're going to be looking at value engineering. Do you know that term? It's an interesting topic. I think you're going to like this one today. I did want to mention something that I did a month or so back now, but because we had a podcasting break in December, I haven't had a chance to tell you about the inquiry into the quality of new housing in England. This was at the Houses of Parliament in London. I've never been inside, so that was an experience in itself. And then to be part of this panel, there were three other groups who were representing various different areas. It was a good cross-section, actually. There was Phil Waller, who'd worked for a major volume house builder, who was very much into, well, I know what goes on and they could be doing much better and things are left all shoddy. And so he's set up a website since he stopped working for these companies just to try and advise you, if you're going down that route, exactly what you should be looking for. Tread carefully if you buy from a big company, and his website, we'll link that up, as I say, a very valuable resource. Jeff Peter from Wingrove Law is a solicitor who represents some people who say, we just got so many snags here that actually they're not getting done as well. He will chase this up. So again, someone else I will link up for you in case, I hope you don't need him, but if you do, he's there. And then there were two different people who were in this building. I think they'd retired and it was a new build. You'd hope a new build for retirement, that it would all be perfect and you could just move in, but no, not this building, and it had a leaky roof and has just kept them busy when this is not what they want to be doing in their retirement. So that was what happened. We had a number of politicians and also people from construction, and it was a really good conversation. I should have taken my microphone down there because I think it was open to the media. And it certainly gave me the impression that we know what a lot of the issues are. A lot of good questions were being asked as well. It's just down to this, will anything get done? I'm not so sure on that, but I wanted to tell you about that anyway. Let's get to our featured interview. Nick Grant from Elemental Solutions is someone who I respect a lot. He's very, very intelligent. I would go so far as to say he's a thought leader here in the UK. There are plenty of subjects that I could have talked to him about because he's a trustee of the ACB. He's the technical director of the Passive House Trust. However, I'm quite pleased on this topic that we fell onto this, because I think this sums him up quite well, how innovative he is, and he's had a lot of experience over the years as well, which has changed his thinking and so forth. So let's just crack on with this. I started by asking him to tell me a little bit about himself and his background.
Okay, so my name's Nick Grant. My background's in engineering, but I feel I've never really had a proper job or never qualified in anything. I dropped out of two universities. I went to UCL, did mechanical engineering, went to Warwick, and did engineering design and appropriate technology, which is kind of hippie engineering. I did 2 years of that, took a year out, didn't go back. I was a bit disillusioned with academia, and it was probably an excuse just not to finish my lab reports and stuff. But then I went off and helped a friend set up a company and did various things. I've always been self-employed, really.
I want to talk to you today about value engineering, and this really comes out of a talk that you gave that I was just really hooked by. In fact, it was probably one of the highlights of the conference. So can you tell me a little bit about the philosophy behind it, first of all?
Yeah, okay. As an engineer, one of the modules, whatever, that I found most inspiring was called value engineering. And it was about how to, as the name suggests, or as I think the name suggests, it's give maximum value, and through engineering, when engineering can mean many things. So value is performance divided by cost. So if you maximize performance or reduce cost, it increases value. So that's kind of a good thing. And when I started working in buildings, I suddenly realized people were using the word value engineering in a very different way. They used it as cost cutting, and it was sort of this negative thing. And I'd been excited by it. It was the thing that made aeroplanes get off the ground. It made cars go faster. It made climbing gear work better and be lighter and stronger. And it was all, in engineering, it's the thing you strive for. And you see it in nature with swallows and swifts. In nature, value engineering has happened through evolution, and without, it's just how stuff works. And in nature, by definition, if something doesn't work, it doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't go on to breed. It doesn't continue. And that's very different to, in architecture, sometimes the idea of taking nature and use biomimicry and so on, which is something I'm actually very skeptical of. But I often use nature as an analogy for how it's very constrained and it is very value engineered through this process of evolution and natural selection. So I went from this thing being something I thought was inherently a great thing and a real challenge and exciting and for me to find really good design to this thing that, people say, oh, it's been value engineered. They've ruined my project. They value engineered it. And I was trying to work out what this was about. And it turns out what really is meant is cost cutting. And that's something that happens when you've already designed it. Value engineering has to happen at the beginning. As soon as you put pen to paper, that's when the value engineering happens. So as soon as you've decided the shape of your building, whether it's 1-story, 2-story, which way it faces, whether you dig into the ground, where your site is, whether your site slopes, all those things immediately start to define the final value, the cost, the challenges you're going to have. And if you haven't done all that at the beginning, when you get to the end and you go out to tender and all the contracts come in at twice the price, then you have to do what's the so-called value engineering, which is get rid of all the nice stuff, put in less good windows, get rid of things, and really destroy what you thought was your lovely design. This is what gives it a bad name.
Who does value engineering? I know we're sitting in a house that you built yourself, and I can just see that you've got a knack for it. So it's an interesting question because we've had a little bit of preamble before this, and you were saying how it sometimes doesn't work that you hire someone to do your value engineering for you.
It's very hard. I mean, I feel like everything I do is value engineering, but it's very hard to get people to pay for it because often they feel they're getting less. You've either told them something really obvious that they didn't, something they didn't need to do, and they've suddenly saved loads of money, but they haven't got anything for it. There's no sort of complex diagram and a specification and some incredible design. You've just suddenly removed a big chunk of the budget and saved time and hassle, and the building works better. But that's often either it seems so obvious or it's, people just feel they've got less. So I think it's very hard to get them. And there are people who will do value engineering, I'm sure, and it exists in industry. I don't know about in house building, but I think as it tends to get used in architecture, it tends to be cost-cutting stuff, and it tends to be the QS and so on doing it. But I think it's got to be completely integrated. Everyone has got to be on board, and that has to be led by the lead designer. They have to encourage everyone and get everyone to do that, because there's a tendency to sort of someone draw something and then everyone has to solve the problems. And if we need to encourage, whether it's the landscape architect or the structural engineer or the energy consultant, to say, look, you could do this better and cheaper and easier if you do this, and people need to join that debate. It tends to be, it's quite hard to get that discussion happening. There's, for whatever reason, it's cultural or whatever.
Can we go back to that equation that you mentioned at the beginning about the value being the performance divided by the cost? Now, in my head, is that something you can physically do? I mean, what is performance?
Yeah, I mean, of course you define it. So sometimes you can, if you're trying to do one widget, so as a component in an engine or something, you could probably do that. You could work out the cost, you could work out to a fraction of a penny, you could work out the performance in some way. So you could do that, but it's much more vague with a house. It's more the concept. It's just to get the idea. And what's interesting is that when value engineering was developed, I think it was during or after the Second World War by GE. You have to Wikipedia that. I did do it a while ago and I've forgotten. But it was an industry. And the thing that was surprising for it is because they needed to reduce cost and make things quicker and easier. But the surprising outcome, and this is the bit that I get excited by, is things ended up working better. So you did something to reduce cost, and then you found it actually worked better, performed better. And I'll struggle to think of examples off the top of my head, but as soon as we stop running the microphone, there'll be thousands of them. But it's just, I mean, examples of, the way phones now, everyone tends to have less buttons on things. So the iPhone as being a sort of, I mean, whether you love it or hate it, but the idea of something that's got, one or two buttons, it's very simple. It is on one level very value engineered. It's not necessarily cheap, but it manages to deliver a lot by doing very little. And it takes a lot of effort to get to that.
Function, then, is an element of a house that's very important. So is this really going to be about simplicity in the end?
Yeah, I mean, some functions you can define. It's maybe attaining a certain temperature or so many hours of not overheating or whatever it is like that. But also function is about being delightful. And they're the harder things to put a value, but you can put a value on. If one house is lovely and in a beautiful view and so on, estate agents will immediately put a value on that. So although it seems hard to put a value, it ends up being surprisingly easy to get a consensus as to what something's worth, even though it's quite abstract, seemingly abstract. So they take the value to mean everything, and it's how something works, it's how it looks, it's the whole. You can make it as broad as you want. But I think defining that, because the other thing is you've got to trade stuff off. So if you want one aspect like a fantastic view, then that might be to the north, so you don't get the sun coming up in winter. And so you're always having to trade one thing with another, where you choose to put a room, how you do things. So I hate the word compromise. There's a nice quote by Charles Eames. It says something like, I'm not aware of ever having to make compromises, but I've had lots of constraints. So I tend to think, compromise, people say, we've got to compromise. It feels like we've, I'm not saying there are never compromises, but it feels like we've run out of time or budget or something. If we spend enough time, we should be able to come to something where it kind of all works. That's a bit of an idealistic view, but yeah.
Does every project, I'm assuming it does, every project has constraints? And that can be taken as a good thing.
Yeah, I think the more, because having no constraints is really difficult. If you've got this huge budget and you can pick the plot anyway, yourself looking for a plot. At the moment, no, as soon as you've got a plot, and the more constraints there are, in many ways, it makes your job easier. You've got less things that you can get wrong. If you've got the choice, like with our site, we could have put the house at one end or the other, and wherever you put it, it was always the wrong place, because someone will come along and say, why didn't you do that? Because it would have been better for this, that, and the other. It would have been worse for other reasons. So constraints are quite free. They let us focus on other things as well. So the more constraints we have, I think as a designer, I take that as I like that. So if we've got a very small budget, limited palette of materials, I quite like the challenge of that.
It's quite interesting. I mentioned this before, have a knack of getting value for money. And in your kitchen in this house, you've come across some clever ways of almost making use of things that you already had. So can you take me back into your past of how you've tried to value engineer and almost your journey of getting better and better at it?
It's probably personal. It's probably how I was born. It's funny, I was just reflecting on this. I think it was a school teacher or something when I was a kid was saying to my parents that one day I'll write a book, How to Live Like a King for £1 a week or something. So even at the age of whatever, at primary school, I must have been doing things that kind of reflect, whether it's making go-karts or inventing things or doing stuff. We didn't have a lot of money and we made things. My parents made chocolates and they were what nowadays we call luxury items. There were these fantastic, the best ingredients and so on. And the constraint there was they had to be eaten within a few days because they had fresh cream and top ingredients, but they made them not very expensive. And they were able to do that by making them close to where they sold them and keeping things very simple. So I've kind of always been interested in that. And my mum always sort of do and mended. We had as a kid, a nursery I can't remember it, but I've seen the photos. It looked like Habitat, but it was old boxes and things painted orange, which was the colour in the late 60s. And so she made things for nothing with a pot of paint and some sort of throwaway stuff, which is, there've been books written about this, but I sort of grew up among all that. And it was out of necessity and parents growing up in the war, coming from Yorkshire, whatever. So, I don't know why, but I find it exciting and interesting.
So I'm getting the feel that a lot of this, it's about cost. Cost is a major impact on value engineering. So what are our options then if we want to reduce cost? We're thinking about a house. How do we start down that road?
I think it's very useful to start with a budget and how much have you got to spend or what do you want to spend on your house? And then that very quickly, lots of things, you don't even have to consider them. You can't afford them, whether it's the indoor swimming pool or the fancy finishes. So I think defining a budget and working to the budget, and often the costs will expand to meet the budget. So even if you've done the value engineering, we have the example of this where we'd worked at some clever detail that was much easier to do on site, and we'd sort of spent some time refining this, and there was no actual saving on the job because the budget hadn't changed. So things just were done a bit more relaxed, and other things maybe took a bit longer. And you know how it is, if you've got a deadline, you'll meet the deadline. I don't know if it's a Peter principle, it's something like that. Things will, budgets, time, whatever will expand to meet what's available. So you've got to do the value engineering, you've got to find a better way of doing things, find more clever materials, but you've got to also set a budget and then work to that budget. And otherwise everything will expand to meet it.
Form is one of those big ones. Why do people not build simple forms? And how can we get around that mindset of actually, this would be a really good route to go down?
Yeah, sat here in our house with a double height space and the complicated corners. So yeah, do as I say, not as I did.
Well, let's talk about this. There's a lot. You've taken me on the grand tour. Yeah. So let's look at some of these aspects. Why were you thinking this way? Maybe describe the shape of the house. We'll include a picture in the show notes and some of the features that you've thought about over the years.
Yeah, so when we designed this house, although, saying value engineering was sort of embedded in it's kind of what I do. So we thought about the cost of materials. We had a very tight budget. We had a £30,000 budget, which we completely blew and went up to £40,000, but that's unrealistic.
Completely blew. I like that.
But if anyone's read Mark Brinkley's book, you'll know that it took us a very long time. So you can do things cheaply, quickly, or well. You can't do all three. So we like to think we did it well and cheaply, but it took a long time. So although we did things like the form we didn't get right in that sense, we were thinking about the cost of materials and economical ways of doing things, but the form was very much driven by a pattern language, which is a book which you'll have probably mentioned on your podcast before. Christopher Alexander, yeah. So great, and very inspiring, still dip into it, very good stuff. And so that was sort of our filter for the world, if you like, of thinking, where does the morning sun come, and creating shapes and alcoves and this sort of thing. Now, that stuff still stands, but in doing that, and the thing with the pattern language is you can't do all the patterns. A lot of them are mutually exclusive. It is just a cookbook of ideas. You can't do all of them. And that's acknowledged, and that's fine. But by doing certain things, we ended up with a very complex form, which did make it a lot more time consuming to build. And our heat loss area, this is the thing, how much area is losing heat relative to the useful floor area. So we've got a form factor of about 5 for our house. So if you're a passive house designer or a building designer and started looking at this, you'll know that sort of 3 or less is good. Flats might be 1.5 or 2. And that is a really magic figure. And it's sort of on one level, it's a boring number, but it is very easy to calculate. And it is kind of a law of the universe that you can't really cheat that. So you can't just keep piling on more insulation to compensate. For value, and this isn't just about energy, if you look at traditional houses, whether it's terrace houses in cities or agricultural workers' cottages, you'll see simple terraces, very compact form, because it's cheaper to do. It's easier to keep the weather out. It's easier to keep warm even the days before insulation. So, and I think there's a bit of a fear now that if you do something like that, it will be boring. And people talk about low energy buildings, particularly passive houses, being a boring box. And we can get very defensive about it. And some passive house designers will try and find examples that definitely aren't boring boxes and are as wacky as possible. But the bottom line is it's more expensive to build something that isn't a simple rectilinear form, and kind of trying to be brave enough to embrace that. Certainly the £1 million houses you see in London, they're boring rectilinear boxes, whether it's your Victorian Georgian terrace, but nice proportions, beautiful quality of materials. There's absolutely no reason. It's a bit more effort to make that.
Looking at, just taking a slight sidetrack, I want to come back to the house in a second, but what I consider to be poor quality developer houses, sometimes they are just boxes and it still goes drastically wrong.
Yeah, I mean, being just a box doesn't mean it's going to be okay. It's interesting sort of what is, and it's very hard for a planner we were meeting with this morning about a project, very hard to specify things that will definitely be okay. And we know it when we see it. And I think there's actually, although everyone has different styles, and I think most people, if you give them a choice between something of quality and something of not, most people get it. And it's very hard to specify that, but it is down to the quality of materials, it's the proportions, it's so many things. And often when developers try and make an effort and make every house on the plot different and face different ways to try and get away from that, it kind of looks worse. And often the very constrained development, the very low cost, some village council housing, so on, can look great. It's just good and honest, and it's fine. It's nothing spectacular, but it doesn't look as crap as where people have really made an effort and try to do a variety of architectural styles and the real pastiche. That's my opinion.
Coming back to your house then, I don't know whether we want to just glance around us. What did you do well? What could have been better?
It's very hard. We're sat here. It's a double height space. There's all sorts of interesting things going on. You can't just sort of imagine straightening it all out and putting another floor in, because then it wouldn't work. We'd have to reconsider it from first principles.
What were the constraints? Can I start like that so that we get an idea of how you got to this?
Yeah, I mean, the form, we didn't really consider it too constrained because we thought we're going to build it ourselves. We can do fiddly shapes. It's just our time. It's not we weren't costing our own time. So we did have constraints to site. We've imposed constraints because we're on the top of a hill somewhere, open countryside. It already had outline planning, but we wanted to hunker the building down. So we went for sort of 1.5 story rather than 2 story. So that's it's like a tall bungalow. So it's inherently inefficient in terms of volume and surface area for floor area. So that was a constraint, but we could have got around that. We could have, it was an imposed constraint. It wasn't inherent. It's very hard because I don't know what we would have designed, what we know now. I know what we're doing for other people. They're different sites, different situations, different people, different requirements. So to rerun our building for our desires on this plot, it's very hard to do that because we've already done it, and
You make the decisions, and then you know why.
Yeah.
Well, you know why you made the decisions as well. And then I suppose, as you're saying, you just keep on learning, don't you? And well, why not? Let's bring up another example then of something that you believe has been well value engineered, a project that you've done recently.
Well, working at Charles Grills is here. We just had a meeting and we're working on a few projects together. And the nice thing there is we're working on repeat projects and we'd like to get some more. And there's local jobs working with a particular builder we work with. And there we've been able to, one of the things is it takes time. Sometimes you'll spend half a day trying to resolve some detail that was tricky on site. You don't normally get to do that because it maybe never happens again, or you're working with a different builder or a different construction method, and no one's paying for that because, to go to the client and say, look, or go to the builder and say, look, if we two of us spend a day on this, we can save you some time. One, they're not going to believe you. One, it just doesn't work like that. Whereas with the repeat work, we're able to do that. We invest the time. Next time it's a bit easier. And each time we just and the whole team works together. And it might be just grumblings down the pub saying, oh, this was a real pain. Can we find an easier way? And, it's that slow evolution. The things move on very slowly. Once you've got to the simple detail that's really great, it might be just how you fit a window into a wall or a door threshold. It looks really simple and no one can work out why it took you 5 years to get to. But when you see what other people have done, you see their drawings, you realize that it isn't that easy, because if it was, everyone, it's almost embarrassing how simple things are once you've done it. I mean, I think it's most good design. It's the simple things, or simple cooking the dish. It's so simple, but it's not easy to do simple.
Windows, then, for a moment, there's a big difference, isn't there, in terms of, well, first of all, if it's just single pane, double glazing, triple glazing, and then also the amount of, mullions that go across. So maybe you could explain that and how you've used fixed windows sometimes and where you would make that choice.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that when we do the Passive House training for the Certified Passive House Designer course, we make a big thing of, because with the Passive House planning package, it calculates every window, the U value, we look at the percentage of glazing and so on. That makes you realise that, so the window here, and this is great for radio, isn't it? So in front of me, we've got our kitchen window, and I normally get people to guess. So Ben, guess what percentage of glass on that window?
Versus the frame.
So how much glass?
I'm going to say, I don't. So there's 80%.
Yeah, that's what most people say. But it's actually 50% frame.
What?
And that's
We'll have to include. Make sure I get a picture of that window.
Get a photo of the window. So it's very counterintuitive, and this is one of the things. There's a very interesting book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and there's intuition, because there's a lot placed on intuition as being this inherently good thing, and intuition lets us do things very quickly and make snap decisions, and without intuition we couldn't function. You have to make these, you can't check everything out and rationally do it. But with the building and design process, you get the chance, because every building you have windows, and you then get this learnt intuition. So I now know that's 50%. I'm not surprised when I see a window. And no one would guess that unless they'd actually calculated. So we're not born with the intuition to know how much of a window is window and how much is frame. It's just, there's no reason why we'd evolve to know that. But by job after job, there's certain things we get to know. So minimizing the mullions and minimizing the transfer. So this goes against the sort of conservation thing of having lots of lovely little, and it's a pattern language thing, little panes of glass. We love it. It's a lovely thing. It's about texture. There's all sorts of biological reasons probably why we love that sort of thing. You can't do that with low energy windows unless you put fake stick on. It comes from when we used to make glass in little pieces, and you couldn't make big sheets of glass. So you had a lot of frame. Now the frame is more heat loss, it's harder to clean, it's more cost. We want single lumps of glass. And then, so it needs a new aesthetic. If we're going to make that look good, and I believe we can, then it's a new way of thinking. We try and take the old design and make it low energy, we end up with high cost, poor performance.
Let's talk about another aspect of optimization, because with Passive House we need shading, don't we? Windows, the size of them we've got to be careful with, and then if we go too big we have to have shades. And so how do we keep that simple?
I've elaborated. I think the presentation you refer to, which is on SlideShare, it probably goes.
We'll link it up.
Yeah, it's probably easy. I'll try and do it verbally, but it's kind of a very visual thing. First thing is not having too much window. So we've tended to a lot of us. We're doing some work on overheating for the Passive House Trust, and it's going to be a masterclass in the new year. And one of the big things we get, a lot of new buildings are overheating. We're getting, even in Scotland and Scandinavia, we're getting overheating problems. And we're in a climate where we don't shut the shutters when you go out. If you're in Italy, you shut the shutters when you go because it is a hot climate. Every day will be sunny in summer. Here we don't have that. So we tend to sort of want to let the sun in, want to let the light in, and we're surprised when we come home and our building's cooked. So the first thing is having enough glass, but not too much. And we want it for views and daylight. And we can do that without going over the top. So that's the first critical thing. And glass costs money. So one of the value engineering things is to make that window do as much work as possible. And one of the things, as you refer to, is going for fixed glazing. So every room in a passive house should have an openable window, whether it's for escape or ventilation or to hear the birds sing. But in our house, we made most of the windows opening, and there's only a few of them. The one above the kitchen, which we tried to get you to guess the percentage of glass of it's 2 opening lights, very sort of cottagey look. We gave it a lot of thought. You probably noticed that, and you're taller than me and longer arms, even you probably can't reach the handles to open the windows. All you can do is take your shoes off, stand in the kitchen sink, get wet socks to open the window. So, some windows you physically can't open, and it would be better as a single framed view, I think. So thinking of the function, thinking which windows need to open is critical.
And cheaper?
Much cheaper. Well, 30, fixed glazing, something like 30, depends on the manufacturer and so on, and how the windows are made. But typically windows we're using at the moment are 30% cheaper for fixed. Just less to go wrong, less likely to be an air leakage problem and so on. But we're not saying it's just, you need enough opening windows, but make sure the ones that do open are big enough, and make sure when they are open, you get airflow, because often they open within a very restricted reveal. You don't get the airflows, particularly at night, that you were hoping. So again, details, and this has evolved over many buildings. We're stepping the reveals or stepping the head so that when you tilt the window, you still get good airflow and you can still put a roller blind or a curtain in. So again, this is sort of details that comes from doing the similar thing over and over again and learning, going back. It's absolutely critical to go back to buildings, there's a tendency to think, if the phone's not ringing and the client's not complaining, we got away with it, no one's trying to sue us. We've got to go back and say, look, what didn't work? It's nice to know what did work, but that's kind of, that's good for our ego, but we want to know what didn't work so we can fix it next time.
This is part of optimization, isn't it, really? So are there any other key aspects that would be relevant to a self-builder when it comes to optimization? There are probably lots.
Loads. I mean, the thing is, work with someone who's done it before. I mean, we didn't use an architect, and there's a lot of things we'd have done better with a right designer, but it's such a gamble when you go out to find any professional. Are you getting their ego, what they want, or are they guiding the process? Everyone's got an agenda, and you don't know who that is, so it's very hard to sort of. Yeah. Was
it almost a challenge? Why did you not hire an architect?
Well, it was completely out of the question. Is that we had no money. We'd borrowed
Value
money.
Engineering.
We were living in a caravan and both self-employed, just setting up self-employed. My partner was making baskets, and just a bit of a culture of always doing things. And I appreciate when other people I see do that, and they don't want to employ me. They want to do it themselves. And that's kind of fine. But so I appreciate that view. It's partly, again, it's me. I tend to try and fix my own car, and I'll tend to that's just me. But the process, and we could have done it ourselves, but having an outside view is always useful.
You won't believe it, but we're nearly out of time. So we've scratched the surface. Are there any other essential parts of value engineering that we should chip in now?
I mean, so much depends on the scale of the project. If you're thinking more about self-build, I think we've covered most. I mean, look, there's some stuff that's in presentations. There's various bits out there, things I've done, which is much more digestible, I think, when it's in a visual form. But I think the key thing is working, deciding what matters and working to your budget, because what is a problem is if you've got a whole list of all these things you want and you want it to look like a Victorian replica and so on, then you've got some of these things you'll have to let go of. Everything isn't possible, but that shouldn't mean there's a compromise necessary. What you end up with, you shouldn't be thinking, I really miss the little Victorian fake windows. You should think, thank God I didn't do that. That's my thought. So I'm afraid, sorry.
Nick,
embrace it.
That's a great ending. Nick, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session, houseplanninghelp.com/111. You can review the key points. We've got some photos of Nick's house, also a couple of the projects that he mentioned as well. And if you'd like to comment, you can do that at the bottom of the show notes or ask a question there. If you're not following Nick on Twitter, you ought to do that. That's something we'll add in, as we will as well the website for Elemental Solutions, all at houseplanninghelp.com/111. So we're pretty much there for today. My call to action, though, is if you haven't been through our course on finding land, then you ought to do that. It's free and it's available in the hub, houseplanninghelp.com/hub. What we've done is, as we've heard various tips and tricks over, I suppose we can start to say, the years, we put this all together in a logical form because, of course, the simplest way and probably the best tip, things like being able to move around. If you can move to where the plot is, just even if it might be miles and miles away, relocating to where the land is good value and there's still a nice neighbourhood. Not all of us are able to do that, or perhaps you're in the southeast of England or near to Edinburgh, somewhere where prices might be higher. So we've got some other ways that you can perhaps look at this and think, well, how am I going to get this land? Things that we've heard about and tied into this course. So go and take a look at that if you're in a similar position to me. I haven't done all of these myself. I keep saying what I should do is blog about it as I go through them. I've gone the very traditional route, but to be fair, it hasn't worked out for me. So I should be trying some of this other stuff. Next time, Phil Skill is my guest. We're going to take our first look at the planning system. What's it all about? How does it affect us when we're buying land and so forth? Phil, really nice guy. So we'll do that next time. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.